Hello, I'm composer Roxanne Saccketti. MHL 241 is my 8th honors course in the Maricopa Colleges. This presentation includes the history and culture covered in the honors paper regarding the development of music notation from antiquity to modern times, which is still advancing as music technology empowers musicians to create new forms of music and music expression. If you would like to read the paper and view the associated PowerPoint presentation, both of which contain the full references to the research contained in this video, please request them in your reply. I hope you enjoy the presentation. The development of music notation from antiquity to the modern age of Western classical music. Baud Cordier, the 14th century French composer, is known for his infamous Belle, Bonne, Sage, the heart-shaped example of art subtilior, which some scholars consider a subcategory of ars nova. Before we begin, let's enjoy a circle canon of Baud Cordier entitled Tout par compas, which is a manuscript animation. In this presentation, we will examine the development of music notation from antiquity to the modern age of Western classical music, which has been influenced by politics, religion, mathematics, philosophy, and technology. First, we look at ancient Mesopotamia. At the University of Philadelphia, a search was in process for Sumerian literary cuneiform tablet fragments. Fragment N4782 from approximately 1750 BCE revealed a new musical term in Old Babylonian cursive, sippum, meaning inversion of the interval. Ann Kilmer, a researcher of musical notation from the University of California, Berkeley, published along with R.L. Crocker in their 1984 article, The Fragmentary Music Text from Nippur, stating that the fragment contained music with a scale and harmonies of thirds. When we examine Mesopotamian notation development, In the area of theory, the music notation system of ancient Mesopotamia was deciphered as a result of the work of several scholars, examining cuneiform tablets of music theory and information regarding lyre strings and tunings from Nippur, Ur, and Assur, all located in ancient Iraq. In the area of scale, the initial discovery of Ugarit tablets in 1928 commenced the excavations. Dated from 1800 to 500 BCE, tablets revealing the notation system contained a 7-note scale. There was a complete song discovered during excavations between 1950 and 1955. This complete song of the cuneiform Hurrian languages was fit together from clay tablet pieces. The Hurrian cult song from approximately 1400 BCE was a hymn to the god Nikal, complete with melody and harmony. The Hurrians were primarily located in this area of Mesopotamia. Their influence was throughout the region. A complete Hurrian cult song known as the oldest song in the world, or Hurrian hymn number 6, is the complete song discovered in the ruins of Ugarit. The next video demonstrates 3 interpretations of the song and information about the background culture during the time of its composition. we examine the development of music notation during the time of ancient Greece. The Greeks had two completely separate systems of music notation, one meant for voice and another for instruments, as evidenced in this ancient Greek music on papyrus, which was discovered in Egypt. The pitches of Greek melody and length of pitches were discovered on marble gravestone columns in Turkey in 1883. The infamous Saccketti epitaph, a first-century complete musical composition, contains lyrics and melody. It is unique as the sole composition which has remained complete throughout history. The melody is engraved in ancient Greek hieroglyphic notation and specifies which syllables the pitch should rise and fall. In the next video, we will actually listen to the Saccketti epitaph, the oldest known complete musical composition evidenced by archaeology.
Eikongelitos emi, titesimes eikilos, entarnemes athanato sema polychronion. Hosonzes paelu, meden holosiu, prosoligo destitose, totelos ochronos apaetei. Hosonzes paelu, meden holosiu, prosoligo destitose, totelos ochronos apaetei. Hosonzes paelu, meden holosiu, prosoligo destitose, totelos ochronos apaetei.
Now we will take a look at some of the elements of notation contributed by the Greeks.
Now here's something very interesting. If we look carefully above this Greek text here, these are some of what scholars have recently discovered are these inflection symbols over the text, which would indicate whether the pitch would rise or fall, or perhaps be long or played in quick succession. So here's what some scholars have decoded these symbols to mean. Looks a little bit like an eye chart, doesn't it? But it's very interesting to see where some of the research is moving in this direction. This is another chart that shows you some of the microtones, which are the spaces between half steps that would be notated with some of these old symbols here. We'll just breeze over this, just wanted to show it to you quickly.
During the Roman Empire, the Roman notation development included Charlemagne, who arranged for plain chant to be notated and for plain chant books to be distributed across Europe. The Roman philosopher Boethius wrote De Institutione Musica. Let's take a look at the De Institutione Musica.
This is your video orientation to LJS 47 from the Schoenberg collection in the Kislak Center of the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. This is a copy of Boethius's De Institutione Musica, written in Paris in about 1490. And this work is a treatise on the Pythagorean-based theory of ancient Greek music, in which the text reflects an older 10th century tradition, but the charts and the diagrams reflect a much newer tradition, so it's sort of a combination of the old and the new. It's in a semi-humanistic script written on paper. It has rubrication and colored initials throughout, and as I mentioned, it has many charts and these lovely diagrams as well. The Pythagorean theory of music was based on ratios, and you can see that reflected in the way the diagrams are designed. And towards the end, the diagrams get quite complex, and they're quite beautiful, I think. This is a lovely manuscript. If you'd like to find out more about this manuscript, you can visit Pen and And, where there are high-resolution digital images of every page, along with a complete description of the manuscript. And this has been your video orientation to LJS 47.
Now we examine the development of chant, neumes, and the staff.
Musicians wanted to make things clearer by adding lines to tame a lot of these symbols, and we have early chant notation known as neumes. That's what these symbols are. This is an early bass clef showing you that line there. And then if we were to read this in modern notation, it would look a bit more like this. Notice that we don't have the familiar rhythmic symbols or time signatures, but this just shows us where pitches rise and fall.
This is a note. Notes are the foundation for Western music notation. But not all notes used to look like this. They looked like this. These are called neumes, otherwise known as Gregorian chant notation or square note notation. Neumes consist of a note or a group of notes that are to be sung on a single syllable. But how did the neume come to be? Let's travel back to the 2nd century BC of ancient Greece. The first existence of music notation was believed to have derived from Greek orthography. Ancient Greek diacritics can be seen on the Sacchetti's epitaph, the oldest surviving complete musical notation. But scholars believe that pneumatic notation stemmed from accentuation signs of Greek and Roman literature, attributed to the philosopher Aristophanes of Byzantium. Accent marks in Greek literature indicated the rising and falling of natural speech patterns. Acutus, or acute, indicated the rising of the voice, while gravis, or grave, indicated the falling of the voice. By the 9th century AD, these marks became the basic figures of Gregorian chant notation. The acutus evolved into a virga, and the gravis evolved into a punctum. Earlier neume notation used the virga to represent a higher pitch than its predecessor note, while the punctum was used to show lower pitches. These neumes were in campo aperto, or free-form wavy lines above the text. The placement of notes acted more as an aid to memorizing the songs due to the fact that memorization was, at the time, more prominent than simply reading them. This practice is called oratorical or chironomic, and is based off of the upward and downward motions of the choir master's hand, giving no indication of the intervals between tones. The Cantatorium of St. Gall is the earliest extant musical manuscript using neumes, which dates all the way back to the year 922. Diastemic neumes are also used as notation, the word diastemic deriving from the Greek word for interval. They indicate the relative intervallic relationship between notes and are more informative than oratorical neumes. The diastemic neumes were placed at various distances around an imaginary line that represented a given pitch. As the 10th century came to an end, the imaginary line became real. Starting out as a mere scratch in parchment paper, a second line was added and the idea of color indicated the pitches of the two lines. The top line was color-coded red, indicating the pitch of F, while the lower line was color-coded green, indicating the pitch of C. In the 11th century, music theologist Guido d'Arezzo fabricated a 4-line staff. The use of color diminished with the invention of the F and C clefs. These clefs were created to be able to be placed anywhere on the staff in order to indicate different pitches. Square pneumatic notation became the general form of notation and the main form for Gregorian chant. It is important to know that Gregorian chant is monophonic and has no meter. These notes are read from left to right and from bottom to top, unless indicated by a specific neum, and aren't sung in major and minor keys, but rather in modes. So, now that we know the fundamentals of Gregorian chant, how do we read square notes? Looking at square notes may be confusing, but by comparing them to modern notation, we are able to break them down. First, let's remember that neumes consist of a note or a group of notes that are sung on a single syllable. The basic note heads for Gregorian chant are the punctum, the virga, and the rhombus. The punctum, virga, and rhombus represent a single note. These note heads technically have no differences, except for the fact that its shape varied over the composer's penmanship. Nevertheless, all note heads can be said to represent the modern transcription of an eighth note. Now, let's go over some different combinations of neumes and compare them to their modern equivalents. The podotus, the clivus, the scandius, the parectus, the climacus recepinus, and the virga subtripunctus. Although Gregorian chant is meterless, there are some symbols that subtly indicate rhythm. The punctum mora, which is adding a dot to a note, the epicema, which means to hold the note or to slow it down, kind of like a ritardando in modern music, and a repercussive neume, a note that is held by having more than one of the same note in a row. Other note symbols in square notation include the quilisma, which is the most controversial note in neume notation. The quilisma is marked by a jagged squiggle in the middle. But the controversy lies in whether the quilisma implies a tremulous sound, to treat it as an ornament or as a lightening of the voice. Liquescent neumes are smaller notes that are attached to normal neumes. They act as a warning sign for careful pronunciation. Here are combinations of liquescent neumes. The epiphonus, the parectus liquescens, and the scandicus liquescens. A flat can also be added to a note to indicate that the note is lowered a half step, and sometimes a flat is written at the beginning of the staff, acting as a key signature, but it is the only accidental used in Gregorian chant notation. A custus is a thin note written at the end of a line to indicate which note is to appear in the next line. Lastly, vertical lines can be drawn to separate musical phrases and sometimes act as a breath mark, letting the singer take a pause. From ancient Greek orthography to square notes, the neume was used as the main form of notation for the medieval era. Not only was it used for Gregorian chant, but secular music of the troubadours and minnesingers also adapted the formula. The use of square notation spread throughout southern and western Europe and continued the practice all the way into the 16th century. Although musical notation has developed immensely since the Middle Ages, many still carry on the old traditions of Gregorian chant.
By the end of the 11th century, the four-line staff was in use, fixing the position of the notes more precisely. You'll notice in this sample the four lines going horizontally. In this next slide, they're beginning to show us how long they would like for us to hold the notes. once you play the note, how long would you sustain it? Notice some of the notes are hollow, some are dark, and some have dots next to them. So all of that was the beginning of rhythm.
The next video demonstrates the development of modes in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Rotem and today we'll talk about modes in the 16th and 17th centuries. We all know that before things came down to merely two different kinds of scales, the major scale and the minor scale, there were different kinds of modes. In the spirit of the scientific Renaissance thinking, many theorists tried to make sense and explain the modes. Often torn between medieval and Greek theories, they invented new ways of naming and recognizing the modes. However, the final outcome of all these theories together was already in old times considered as a complete mess. In this episode, we'll try to put some order in the subject and see what we can nevertheless learn from the modes. Modes, first mentioned in the 9th century, were originally a way of grouping and categorizing Gregorian chants. Modes are made of specific sequences of notes, as opposed to the way that we think nowadays on scales as octaves. The modes are formed by sequences of 5 notes and of 4 notes, called also species of fifths and of fourths. Within the diatonic system, there are only so many acceptable variants for these sequences, that is, variants in which the perfect fourths and fifths can be ordered in successions of whole steps and half steps. If we take the various species of fifths and place the various species of fourths above them, we get the 4 authentic modes, one on D, also called Dorian, one on E, Phrygian, one on F, Lydian, and one on G, Mixolydian. The first note at the bottom of the species of fifth is also called the finalis of the mode, as it is normally the note on which the piece ends. Now, if we put the species of fourths below the species of fifths, we get the 4 plagal modes, Hypodorian, Hypophrygian, Hypolydian, and Hypomixolydian. These 8 groupings, which are based on the 4 different finalis notes, D, E, F, and G, are the famous 8 modes. So we have 8 modes, but aren't there actually 12 modes? Well, it depends whom you ask. Let's see. As we saw, the 8 modes are based on 4 different finalis notes, D, E, F, and G. Glareanus, however, in his 1547 book called Dodecachordon, suggested that there were actually more modes if we considered 2 more finalis notes, namely A and C. A mode on B was still out of the question, since its 5th degree is a diminished interval. So based on the finalis A, we have the Aeolian mode with its authentic and plagal versions. And based on the finalis C, we have the Ionian mode, of course also with its authentic and plagal versions. With these 4 new modes, we have a total of 12 modes. This set of 12 modes was accepted by many, most famously by Zarlino, who presented it in his influential 1558 book Istituzioni Armoniche. However, some years later, Zarlino decided to renumber the 12 modes, having the first mode start on the finalis C, so that which was previously the 11th mode with the Greek name Ionian now became the first mode with the Greek name Dorian. Whatever reasons he had for that renumbering, it ended up being simply too confusing. And although this numbering was adopted by some, on the whole, it just added another level of difficulty to a subject already full of controversies. The modes were originally invented and employed in the context of monodic chant. How then the modes were explained in the 16th century, when polyphony was so central in music? Applying the theory of modes to polyphony was not simple. but the theorists of the Renaissance loved these kinds of challenges. Here we are again with the famous Zarlino. He suggested that the mode of a polyphonic piece is defined in accordance with its tenor voice. If the tenor voice is in the first mode, for example, the whole piece is then considered to be in the first mode. However, since in polyphony voices have overlapping ranges, if the tenor is in an authentic mode, the bass would be plagal, and the canto and alto will be equivalent to the tenor and bass, just an octave higher. In contrast, if the tenor were in a plagal mode, the other voices would be adjusted accordingly. This is a good time to mention that when a range of a mode is not comfortable, that is too low or too high, there is always the possibility of transposition. In this case, for example, we have the plagal version of the Dorian mode, the hypodorian, or the second mode, and we see that it is way too low and out of the comfortable vocal ranges described by theorists. Transposition in the Renaissance is a rather uncomplicated procedure. It consists of simply adding a flat to the key, and this will take the music a fourth higher or a fifth lower. In practice, the second mode is almost always transposed in that manner, since, as you saw, its untransposed version is simply too low. This is an important concept, namely that the musical system can theoretically be either untransposed, cantus durus, or, with the help of one flat, transposed, cantus mollis. Transpositions as we know them, with all the different accidentals, did take place in practice throughout the 16th century, but it was not until the middle of the 17th century that they began appearing in written out compositions. Until now, we saw that the mode contains the finalis of a piece, what we now call the key of the piece, as well as its general range. Modes, however, may be also manifested by other characteristics, such as the degrees on which cadences will be made, the way imitations or fugal entrances should be composed, and lastly, by their affects or ethos. Let's see. Cadences mark important structural moments in a piece, and the degrees of the mode on which cadences take place have an important role in making the piece modally coherent. For each mode, theorists supplied a list of cadence points according to their importance. The first point, often called the first cadence, is on the actual note of the mode, its finalis. The secondary cadence is very often a fifth above the main note of the mode. And the next cadence point, the third cadence, is often on the third degree of the mode. Some modes, however, are often treated differently. The third and fourth modes, for example, the Phrygian modes, are exceptional in their form. Even if one would try to normalize all the theory of the modes into only major and minor modes, the Phrygian modes would still need their own category. In any case, the secondary cadences of the third and fourth modes are, according to some theorists, on C and A respectively. According to other theorists, however, the cadences are on the fifth degree of the mode, like in most modes. The cadence points are not consistent among theorists. Some theorists even mention the use of peregrine cadences which are not typical for the mode. Dressler, for example, wrote that such cadences might disturb the sense of hearing when they are used unseasonably, and therefore recommended to beginner composers to avoid them. But by saying that, he actually implies that employed carefully, it is possible to use whatever cadence you want. And by saying that, he made the theory of modes a bit weaker and less coherent than it already is. On the basis that authentic modes are built with the species of fifth and then fourth, and plagal modes are built with the species of fourth and then fifth, Di Ruta gives help in composing or improvising imitations. If we are in an authentic mode, for example, the subject should emphasize the range of the species of fifth, like so. But then its answer, often made by the plagal neighboring voice, would be transformed and adapted to the species of fourth, like this. You will find some nice polyphonic examples of this in the footnote. When composing a piece, the first task of a composer is to choose in which mode the composition will be. He is expected to do so according to the text and desired effect of the piece, and when relevant, according to the liturgical context. Theorists supplied us with information concerning what effect is appropriate for each mode, but of course the opinions are rather varied. However, there are some things that repeat rather often. For example, the second, fourth and sixth modes, or plagal modes, are often referred to as appropriate for said texts because they are lower than their authentic counterparts. Specifically, the second mode is almost always transposed higher, but then it has a flat, which gives another reason to categorize it in a more sad or soft class. Another rather consistent point is the description of the third mode as suitable for harsh and angry texts. This might be because this mode is based on the note Mi, which is considered hard and harsh in Renaissance terms. However, some theoreticians wrote that this mode, as well as the fourth mode, are appropriate for mournful subjects and lamentations. In the case of the Lydian mode, there are extreme inconsistencies. Some wrote that this mode is pleasant and lively, while others wrote that it is severe, hard and threatening. These kinds of inconsistencies might be explained by the fact that different writers were referring to different mode theories. But all in all, this kind of confusion is very familiar for those who are interested in modes, back then and today. The theories we have presented up until now are either from the 16th century or later, but based on influential 16th century sources such as Glarean or Zarlino. While these theories were still circulating in the 17th century, a new trend in mode theory started to emerge. Let's see. From the beginning of the 17th century, writers presented systems of 8 different tuoni, tones or tonalities, which were based on the psalm tones and their usual transpositions. They were similar to the traditional 8 modes, but with some apparent differences. Most noticeably, one no longer made a distinction between authentic and plagal modes. One of the early examples of this is found in Banchieri's 1605 L'organo suonarino. Let's point out some details. The first mode is on D, as it used to be. The second mode is by now officially transposed to G with a flat. The third mode is on A, like the missing Aeolian 9th and 10th modes Glarean added. The fourth mode is on E, as it used to be. The fifth mode is now on C, but the sixth mode is still on F, where it used to be, but with a flat. Both modes seem now like the 11th and 12th Ionian modes Glarean added, or in modern eyes a standard major key. The seventh mode is on D with a flat, which makes another Aeolian mode, and the eighth mode is on G, as it used to be. Excluding the seventh mode, that according to some writers later in the century got a sharp and turned from a minor mode to a major mode, this set of tuoni is found in treatises throughout the century. The problem with the history of the modes is that it's not linear. It didn't just go from one theory to the next. Different theories were invented and used, coexisting along with older theories. Here is a very short summary. The 8 modes and the psalm tones, which are not at all the same thing, were established back in the Middle Ages. In 1547, Glaran extended the system of 8 modes and added 4 new modes. His theory was accepted by many, including the famous Zarlino, who then decided to confusingly renumber the new system of 12 modes. While all these theories were still circulating, a new system of 8 modes came about. This system was based on the psalm tones, which are not modes but mere melodic formulas. Many writers disregarded this nuance, which added another layer of confusion. During the 17th century, writers complained that it's impossible to study the modes due to their messy literature. Already in 1622, Camillo Angleria wrote, "Many have written about the formation and recognition of the modes, but one is confusingly different from another, and for this reason many cannot perceive in what mode a composition might be when seeing it, and much less when only hearing it." Towards the end of the 17th century, writers such as Christopher Simpson and the famous Marc-Antoine Charpentier are suggesting that in fact there are only 2 modes, a major one and a minor one. This is more or less the end of the Renaissance modal theories and the beginning of the major and minor era that has continued on until today. Now you know why you never really understood modes. Because no one did. Many tried, but in fact just added new layers of confusion. However, so you won't feel as if you wasted your time watching this presentation, let's try and see what we can nevertheless learn from the modes when reading and performing music from the Renaissance. The mode of a piece, as the container of the piece, may tell us things about the piece before even reading it. But since the modal theories are incoherent, when we look at a piece, we should try and understand how the specific composer of that piece saw the modes, on what finalis the mode is based, where he believed that the cadences should be normally, and at what points he decided to step out from the norm, and why he chose that specific mode over other modes to enable him to express the text with the right effects. By understanding a little bit more of the composer's thinking, we may better understand the composition, and by that, hopefully, we would be able to achieve a better performance. So this was our show about modes. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. Feel free to comment, share and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.
The next video discusses the development of rhythm modes.
In medieval music, the rhythmic modes were set patterns of long and short durations. The value of each note is not determined by the form of the written note, but rather by its position within a group of notes written as a single figure called a ligature, and by the position of the ligature relative to other ligatures. Modal notation was developed by the composers of the Notre Dame school from 1170 to 1250, replacing the even and unmeasured rhythm of early polyphony and plain chant with patterns based on the metric feet of classical poetry, and was the first step towards the development of modern mensural notation. The rhythmic modes of Notre Dame polyphony were the first coherent system of rhythmic notation developed in Western music since antiquity. Though the use of the rhythmic modes is the most characteristic feature of the music of the late Notre Dame school, especially the compositions of P. Rodin, they are also predominant in much of the rest of the music of the Ars Antiquae until about the middle of the 13th century. Composition types which were permeated by the modal rhythm include Notre Dame organum, conductus, and discant clausuli. Later in the century, the motets by Petrus de Cruz, and the many anonymous composers, which were descended from discant clausuli, also use modal rhythm, often with much greater complexity than was found earlier in the century. For example, each voice sometimes sang in a different mode, as well as a different language. Thank you for watching. For more educational videos, please subscribe to WizScience on YouTube or visit wizscience.com.
Next, we will examine the significant contributions of Ars Nova and Franconian notation. In the early 14th century, the Ars Nova movement developed newer, more standardized notation. The Franconian use of long, breve, and semi-breve to denote divisions of length was carried over and combined with color to signify change in meter. The system further developed, utilizing the maxima long, breve, semi-breve, minimeme, semiminimeme, fusa, and semifusa. These would equate, starting with the breve, to double whole note, half note, quarter note, eighth note, and 16th note. Triple meter was the only meter that flowed well with Franconian notation. Ars Nova notation marked the first time that duple meter was widely used. Imperfect divisions of the long breve and semi-breve were made into 2 equal parts, and the perfect subdivision of each into 3 equal parts resulted in triple meter. Time signatures also became widely used during this time. A vertical slash through the time signature represented cut time. The next video explains the impact that the printing press made on music publishing.
This is a page from the earliest known book of printed musical pieces, dating from the 1470s. With music, as with words, the task for the printer was to reproduce notational conventions that had been developed in handwritten forms. The problem was that in music, the notational forms were much more complex than for simple word texts. In this sequence, we're going to look at some of the technological problems and solutions that were specific to the printing of music. Not surprisingly, early printed music related to the most valued repertory of previously written music, the liturgical music of the church. In the beginning, it had been reproduced by monks copying by hand, and music manuscripts were often the opportunity for elaborate decorative artwork. But some of the most striking features of the originals, such as the use of 2 or more colours and prominent capital letters, also served a practical function for the performance of the music. Early music printing attempted to reproduce these features. There were elaborate woodcuts for the capital letters, and double impression printing was used, in which the lines were printed first in one colour or shade, and then the notes and words were added in another. Sometimes the notes even ended up on the right lines. There was a natural pressure to simplify this process, and once multiple colours were abandoned, the obvious thing to do was to give every musical note a separate piece of type, just as every alphabetical letter had a piece. But while letters are strung out in a series along one line, music has to accommodate notes located on different lines and spaces to denote the pitches, and notes of different shapes to denote the durations. There are also subtleties of spacing to consider to avoid the notes becoming crowded. And when you had to fit words or syllables under the notes as well, the situation got more complicated still. Here at the Plantin Moretus Museum in Antwerp, we have some preserved examples of 16th century music type, and we can see how the printed music was literally put together. For each note, you would need a separate piece of type. Here's one with the note head on the middle line of the stave. If you wanted to build an ascending scale, you would go from there to one with a piece of type on the next space, and then on the next line up, and the next space, and on the top line. You could save the number of pieces of type by turning it the other way up, and so now we have the ascending scale of all the notes from the bottom line up to the middle line. You'll notice that in this note the stem goes from the middle of the head. But music written in manuscript usually has the stems going to the sides of the note heads, left or right, whichever the composer or copyist preferred. Music printing eventually followed this convention. But in order to make the note invertible, it standardized the pattern. And in fact it then gradually changed the way people wrote manuscript music, so that the down stem went to the left hand side of the head and the up stem to the right hand side. As well as a piece of type for each note, you needed a piece of type for each musical symbol, and for bar lines, and for pieces of empty stave. It becomes more complicated if you want to put one note above another, or if you want to put a rest into one of the spaces between the stave lines. In this case, instead of having a single piece of type, you have to build it up with a separate piece of type for each of the 5 stave lines. You need quite a lot of pieces of type to make up a complete line of music. But in this system, you can put the notes on every line or space, and you can put pieces of stave line in where you need them. The disadvantage is that it shows up little gaps between the various pieces of type, and therefore the stave lines are not as solid as they would be if you drew them as a single line. You can see how all of this fits together in one of the most ambitious music books printed by Christopher Plantin. Here in the library there's a copy of that book. It's a collection of masses composed by Georges de la Hella and published in 1578. It's a very big book, and it has to be because it shows the parts for the 6 singers laid out on one double opening of pages. The start of each part is marked by the large capital letters. Remember also that the size of the type would have to be large because 6 people would be singing from this book at the same time. It's not like just one person reading a book by themselves. Here at the Plantin Museum, they've made a reconstruction of the complete set of type or form for one of the parts. It would have come off the press like this, and if we look at the type, it appears to us as upside down. If you look at the form the other way round, so that the words are underneath the notes, you have to read the music from right to left. Here you can see the woodcut for the capital F and the pieces of type for the clefs at the start of each line. Here you can see how the separate pieces of type have made the stave line broken and uneven. And where the printer had to put in a rest, he had to make this up from the separate pieces of type. You can see the gaps between them falling into the spaces between the stave lines. The dot after this note also had to be made out of 5 separate pieces of stave line. The sharp sign here is on a piece of type that covers 3 of the lines, so it had to be made up with an extra piece of type for the line at the top and another piece of type for the line at the bottom. Although the letterpress style of music printing was rather fiddly to set up, it could still look quite attractive if it was based on type designed by such masters of the craft as Grandjean and Fournier. It proved inadequate, though, as new styles of music developed. Separate notes to each syllable in vocal music quite suited the letterpress style, but successions of fast notes for violin or harpsichord didn't suit it so well. For these, a different sort of technology was needed.
The next video discusses the development and use of figured bass in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Hi everybody and welcome back. I'm Professor Seth Monahan, a guy who actually does music theory for a living, and this is the 6th video in my series on the basics of classical harmony and counterpoint. The title of this video is What is Figured Bass? And it actually falls into 5 parts. First, we're going to ask what figured bass is. We're going to use figured bass to turn arcane symbols under a score into notes that we can hear. Then we're going to work backwards, talking about how we can take a given chord and turn it into figured bass. We're going to talk about the standard abbreviations used in figure bass. We're going to talk about how to alter notes, how to use notes that are not in the key. And finally, we're going to talk about motion above a stationary bass and how figured bass shows this. But let's start with the very basics. What is figured bass? So let's start with a piece of music. Here's the opening of Johann Sebastian Bach's Sonata in C for flute and continuo. Now, the name taken on its own might suggest that this is a piece for 2 instruments, a flute, whose part is on the top, and a continuo, whatever that is, whose music is on the bottom. Now, I want you to listen to a recording of this passage and take stock of how many instruments you actually hear and how what they're playing relates to the music on the screen, which I remind you is the entire score. These are all the notes that Bach wrote. Now, I'm probably not going out on a limb to assume you noticed that there was a flute. And you probably also heard a low string instrument playing the bass line. It's a historical instrument called a viola da gamba. But if you listened carefully, I bet you also noticed someone playing chords, in this case on a Baroque harpsichord. Now, as it happens, the second 2 instruments are both reading from the bottom staff. And if you'd wondered how on earth the harpsichordist knew what chords to play, because Bach sure didn't write any in the score, I might take a moment to point out the numbers and accidentals scattered at points beneath the staff. Those symbols are called bass figures, and their job is to tell people who play chordal instruments what notes to play above each bass note. And together, the bass line and those numbers make up what's called figured bass. And as a little sidebar, we're now ready to understand that continuo isn't an instrument at all. It's actually whatever group of instruments happens to be reading the figured bass off that bottom staff. The combination we just heard, a keyboard and a low string instrument, is probably the most common, but others are totally possible, and it doesn't even have to involve more than one person. Here's a recording where a gamba player actually handles the bass line and the chords. So figured bass is essentially a shorthand system for notating harmonies above a bass line. And we see it mainly in 17th and 18th century accompaniment parts, very often with the instrument itself, as we just saw, not specified, simply anybody who can play chords to support the music we're going to make. And the integers themselves, the numbers we see under the staff, represent intervals to be played above the bass note. So as a very simple example, here is a B with the integers 6 and 3 written underneath it. The 6 tells the player to play a sixth above the bass. In this case it's G, and the 3 tells them to play a third above the bass, in this case D. So we have just realized a very simple figured bass. But here's the thing, the intervals are actually not literal. And what I mean by this is that we see a 6 and a 3 here, they tell us to play a G and a D. But that G or D may be doubled or displaced by octaves, and the exact voicing, the exact way that the D and G are played on the keyboard is at the player's discretion. So for instance, in playing the chord at the right, I could do this, but if I wanted to, I could also double the D at the octave and play that chord instead. I could double the G as well and play this much richer chord. I could decide that that thing on the top staff is way too wide for a human hand. I could drop the original D, so now the only D is not a third above the B, it's actually a third plus an octave above the B. That's totally fine. And indeed, in many cases, we'd be able to double the B as well, so this would equally be a perfectly good realization of this figured bass. Another critical thing to take note of here is that figured bass can give us any combination of notes, not just familiar chords. As I mentioned in the last video, a lot of students who've learned a bit of theory associate figured bass with chord inversions and think that they always refer to a chord. They don't. Have a look on the right. Now we're going to take a much more daunting set of figures, 7, 6, 5, 2. So above the B, that would be A as the 7th, G as the 6th, F sharp as the 5th, and C as the 2nd. We've just made that chord with figured bass. Whether or not that's a good idea, of course, is a different question. But once again, we could decide to revoice this. We could, for instance, put the C and the F sharp up on top, giving us like something like this. That's an equally valid way of realizing that very complicated figured bass. Even if the original bass note had been down an octave and all of the notes of our chord were more than an octave away from it, that would still be fine. And while we're here, it's worth noticing all the information that figured bass doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us anything about chord quality. It doesn't tell us how a given bunch of notes functions in a key like a Roman numeral does. It doesn't even tell us whether the notes we're playing are technically part of a chord at all. I'm not sure what chord that thing is. We could debate it, I suppose. But the point is, there's a reason for all of this. None of those concepts, chord roots, chord functions, existed at all when figured bass was developed. Ideas that we take completely for granted, like that every key has a certain number of chords, and these chords have a thing called a root, and the chords can be inverted. These ideas were all developed way after figured bass was made standard. So you may be asking yourself, well, if figured bass is this antiquated way of doing things, why do we learn about it? Well, obviously, if you're going to play a historical continuo instrument, if you're the person playing that gamba in that recording of the flute sonata, you're going to have to be able to read figured bass. But why would a garden variety music student know or care about a shorthand system from 350 years ago? Well, one reason is just historical curiosity. If you're a curious, thoughtful musician, it's really fascinating to think that composers in Bach's time and before didn't think about harmony in terms of roots and inversions and chord qualities. Amazingly, they thought instead in terms of figured bass and counterpoint. We can broaden our minds just trying to think as they thought. Maybe more importantly and more down to earth, we also learn figured bass because it's still in use, although mainly as an analytical tool.
Notation in early America is evidenced with the shape notation in Appalachian singing schools.
When I was a little girl, I grew up in the mountains of Appalachia. Still have a lot of family that lives there today, and it's still very mountainous, rugged, somewhat isolated, but very beautiful. When I was a little girl, a lot of the homes didn't have electricity and didn't have running water and or plumbing. We still got our drinking water from the creek, and we used kerosene lamps. So as you can imagine, there wasn't a lot to do back then. My family was of Scots-Irish descent and English descent. Had a lot of musical people in my family. In fact, Dan Seals is a distant relative of mine. I had a lot of family members who played the dobro, they played the fiddle, they played the banjo, and some of those family members made their own instruments. They couldn't afford to go into what they called town and purchase those instruments, so they made them themselves. It was quite interesting. Anyway, when I was a little girl, we used to go to church and we would attend what we called singing schools. A lot of the churches back then were poor and they couldn't afford instruments. We'd have what we call singing schools, and we learned to sing the shape notes, or as they call it today, harp music, or what it's sometimes known as is harp music. This was the music that was featured in the movie Cold Mountain, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, the shape notes. And as a very small child, it was very, very easy for me to learn to read these notes. And later on, I taught myself how to play the piano using this musical theory, because as a child, it was easier for me to remember these shape notes rather than the lines and spaces that typical musical lessons are based on. Anyway, I wanted to give a quick overview of how I sing-song these notes. Maybe I'll have a grandkid one day, or a great-grandkid that needs to do a school project on Appalachian traditions. Anyway, I'm going to give you a small overview of how we did that. So this is Amazing Grace. It's a universally known song, and it was one of the first songs that we as children, very small children especially, were taught to read the shape notes, or harp music, as some refer to it, to learn new songs. Now, as a child, it was easy to identify the various tones of the musical scale with a shape rather than the lines and spaces that you typically would learn music from in today's world. So the first three notes on Amazing Grace are sol, la, and do. Sol is egg-shaped, la is square, and do is triangle-shaped. That was very easy for me to learn as a child. In fact, as I got older, maybe 8 or 9, I started teaching myself how to play the various instruments, mainly the piano, based on this shape note theory. It was very easy to transpose, change keys, and it was much simpler and much easier for a child to pick up rather than trying to remember the lines and spaces here. Now, as I got older, I learned the lines and spaces, but I still, when I go to a songbook like this, it's just so much easier for me to do the shape notes rather than doing the lines and spaces. Now, I'm no singer, so don't pay attention to the way I sing, but I'm going to demonstrate just the first line here of how it sounded when we used to sing these out. And the whole church would join in and sing the shape notes, or harp music as some people call it. So the whole congregation would be singing this at one time. And this is how we learned new songs when we got new songbooks. It made it a lot easier when you knew how to read that music. Sol, la, do, mi, re, do, la, sol. Sol, la, do, mi, re, mi, sol. And so forth and so on. It kind of sounds like you're singing in a different language, really. And as I said, as I got older, I learned to transfer this theory of shape notes, harp music, onto musical scales for instruments. I learned to play various instruments based on this theory. It's a very simple theory, but as I said, as a child, it's very easy to associate the shapes with the tones of the music and to apply it to a musical scale. So I was able to learn to play several instruments based on this old mountain theory of harp music, or as we called it, shape notes. Now, they do have an annual harp music convention every year in Cades Cove, just outside Pigeon Forge in Maryville here in Tennessee. It's very crowded. Usually a lot of people attend from all over the world, so I've not been able to go to it yet, but I do plan on trying to go to that before I die. That's on my bucket list, because some of my fondest childhood memories were growing up in the old mountain church, attending the singing schools, and learning the rudiments of music and learning to read music by shape notes, or as some people call it, the harp music. I still have my grandfather's rudiment book, and the one thing we had to learn before we learned anything else in singing schools, and if we learned this at the end of the week, the singing school teacher, usually the old singing school teacher, would give us a piece of candy at the end of the week, and it was this: music is the science of sound, or rhythmical succession, or a combination of pleasing sounds. We had to learn that by the end of the week, and if we learned it and could recite it in front of the congregation, we got a piece of candy, and that was a big highlight of ours. So this is just another tradition of Appalachian lore, and hopefully one day my grandkids or my great-grandkids will want to do a paper or some kind of research project on the old mountain traditions, and this was one of my fondest memories. Hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great day.
In the 1970s, Rainier Wehinger created a visual listening score to accompany Georgi Ligeti's articulation. Donald Craig scanned the pages and synchronized them with the music. Enjoy. Notation is never over. Remember, it's not the end, it's only the beginning.